Every athlete leaves something behind. Not just records, but moments that changed the way the game felt. Some stories are loud. This one isn't. Tonight, we slow it all down. And listen. This is The Boy Who Wouldn't Stop Flying. The quiet rise of Tony Hawk, emotional skateboarding story. There was a silence between the trees. Somewhere in Southern California, past the rusted fences and the golden haze of a late afternoon, sat a half-forgotten skate park. The rails still held fingerprints of scraped metal. The ramp creaked softly under its own weight, like a memory. And at the edge of that ramp stood a boy. Not loud, not big, not fearless. Skinny, quiet, looking down like the drop was the mouth of something that tried to swallow him whole. But in his chest, there was movement. Not the twitch of fear, but something almost musical. Like the rustle of wind through an unopened letter. He bent his knees, shifted his weight, let the board roll back, then forward. And for a flicker of a moment, the wheels left the earth. Just for a moment. This isn't a story about fame. Not yet. It's not about money. Not really. It's about a boy who never quite fit. Not in the lines, not in the teams, not in the schools. They said he was too much. Too wild, too soft, too intense. But skateboarding doesn't ask you to sit still. It doesn't mind if you cry sometimes. It just asks, will you try again? The boy didn't know what he was becoming. But he knew this. When he skated, his mind quieted. When he fell, he got back up. And when he flew, even for half a second, he felt like maybe he could belong. In time, neighborhoods would know his name. Pixels would carry his image into living rooms. Children would imagine what it's like to hover midair, weightless, timeless. But back then, he was just a kid on a ramp. No championships, no cameras, just a borrowed board, a sky too big, and the beginning of a whisper. A whisper the world would one day listen to, as it turned into flight. Before gravity ever knew his name, before photographers squinted through viewfinders to catch him in midair, before logos, there was this. A backyard, a cracked stretch of concrete, and a boy they didn't understand. He cried when he struck out, panicked in crowded places. His thoughts ran faster than his voice could keep up. Too much energy, they said. Too sensitive, too intense. He didn't fit the rhythm of other kids. Always too early, or too late. Doctor's visits, meetings with teachers, words like gifted and difficult. Praise and worry tangled like headphone cords. His parents did what they could. They listened. They tried routines, sports, folded charts pinned to the fridge. But on most days, Tony felt like a mistake written beautifully wrong. Until one wandered afternoon, his older brother handed him a skateboard. It was chipped, worn smooth by someone else's dreams. The grip tape was torn. The wheels didn't match. He didn't care. He stepped on it, pushed softly, felt it twitch beneath him like a living thing. And something quiet happened, not a roar, more like space, inside his head. For once, the thoughts slowed down. The noise dimmed, and the movement that got him in trouble everywhere else became the only thing that made sense. He wasn't trying to impress anyone. There was no trophy waiting, no applause hiding in the bushes. Just motion, and the way it made him feel less jagged inside. Soon, he'd skate until the streetlights blinked on. Shoelaces frayed, knees bruised, palms always scuffed, but he kept riding. And slowly, that little stretch of cracked backyard concrete started to feel less like a place, and more like a voice. Skateboarding didn't call him broken. Didn't try to slow him down. Didn't ask him to be anyone else. It just whispered, "Come as you are." And he did. Again, and again, and again. He didn't yet know what it meant to fall in love with something. But if he had the words, maybe he'd describe it like this. The first time his wheels kissed pavement, he didn't feel fixed. But he didn't feel wrong, either. And for a kid like Tony, that was more than enough. School wasn't made for a boy like him. Too quick to raise his hand, too restless to stay seated. His mind leapt over subjects like they were small cracks in a sidewalk. Teachers gave him labels. His parents gave him understanding. But even that wasn't always enough. Second grade math bored him. Group projects frustrated him. Recess made him nervous. The rules never felt like they bent with him, only broke. At parent-teacher conferences, they called him gifted. Then difficult. Then anxious. The words kept changing, but the problem always felt the same. No one knew quite where to place him. Until one day, someone built a garden for the chaos. It came in the shape of plywood. Bolts. Rails. Permission slips on the kitchen counter with scribbled blue ink. Off-campus skate demo, okay to attend. Bit by bit, his time shifted. From after-school programs to empty warehouse bowls. From lunch breaks to alleyway kickflips. From fitting in to flying out. He wasn't sneaking away. He was being given room to be. Rooms with ramps instead of desks. With pads instead of grades. And in those places, things began to click. Falling didn't mean failure. Trying again wasn't punished, it was expected. Some weekends, his dad would drive him 2 hours just to skate a new park. He'd sit in the car with a thermos and a book, and Tony would lose himself in minute after minute of rolling sound and wooden air. His knees were scraped more often than not. His shins bruised like fruit on a high shelf. But he didn't mind. Skateboarding never asked him to wait his turn. It didn't need handwriting. It didn't check spelling. It just said, start here. Fall there. Keep going. He didn't know then that his life would one day be measured in revolutions. Degrees spun. Frames captured. Back then, it was simpler. It was the helmet that finally started to smell like summer. The board that began to feel like an extension of his self. The sight of strangers clapping, not because he was good, but because he kept trying. Each time he dropped into a bowl, he took a silence with him. Some loneliness, some not quite fitting in. But skateboarding spoke in a different language. And slowly, the boy who never quite belonged started building a world where he did. Not in grades, not in trophies, but in movement, unmeasured, uncontained, unmistakably him. It was the 1980s. Everything was loud, the music, the clothes, the assumptions. But inside the halfpipe, the noise faded. There, air became space to think, and sound became rhythm under wheels. Tony didn't speak much, not back then. He was younger than the rest. Smaller, quieter, surrounded by guys with nicknames and bruises like tattoos. They didn't baby him. They didn't cheer either. They just watched, half curious, half dismissive. But Tony didn't come to impress anyone. He came to skate. He fell more than most. But when he landed something, a new grab, a tighter spin, it came with a kind of weightlessness. Like the board was less a plank and more a promise. He started inventing things by accident. Grinds that hadn't been named. Flips that didn't have descriptions yet. No one told him the rules. So he kept rewriting them. Something was happening. Older pros who used to glance his way were now pausing their own runs. Watching this small kid carve up empty air with strange, beautiful precision. They asked, how did he do that? Where did he learn that? But Tony couldn't explain. It wasn't a strategy. It wasn't a plan. It was motion, moving through him faster than language. He made tricks to fit how his body wanted to move, tucked, narrow, technical. Not brute force. Just thought, turned into flight. Some called it weird. Some called it style. But Tony never cared for either. He was busy chasing something else. A feeling he couldn't name. The quiet thrill of near impossible things almost becoming real. Bit by bit, word spread. Not in headlines, but in whispers. A VHS tape passed from one sweaty palm to another. Watch this kid, they'd say. He's doing stuff nobody else even tries. In hotel rooms. In skate shops. In parking lots under dying lights. They'd rewind and watch again. The boy they barely noticed was becoming something you couldn't ignore. Not because he asked to be seen, but because his skateboarding started to feel less like sport and more like language. Letters traced in the air. Sentences stitched from movement. A story being written upside down and sideways. And every time he stepped into the bowl, he turned the page. It started like most things do, quietly. A local competition in Oceanside. Hometown kids. A few parents with folding chairs. No big banners. No fireworks. Just a ramp, a list of names, and a boy with knees too scarred to count. He rolled up, smaller than the others. Helmet fastened too tight. Eyes scanning the lines, not the crowd. Nobody expected much. Maybe a sloppy drop in. A half-hearted spin. But then he moved. And suddenly, something shifted. The way he hit the transitions. The control in midair. It wasn't loud. It wasn't wild. It was clean, precise, unnatural in the most natural way. He didn't stomp the tricks. He landed them like punctuation. Soft, certain. A local skater taped it, just for practice. A camcorder wobbling slightly in the breeze. They passed the tape around. Skate shop to skate shop. Yo, check this kid. The little one. No music. No edit. Just footage. But enough to make people sit up a little straighter. Tony was 12, barely filling out the pads he wore. But in that grayscale grain of VHS, he looked like more. He didn't roar into tricks. He slid into them, like a whisper catching wind. Everything he did looked like it was meant to be done. No struggle, no panic, just motion, just Tony. The footage kept moving, through hands, through cities. Laptops hadn't been invented, but the myth had. He didn't talk much in interviews. Didn't chase the camera. But everywhere that tape went, doors opened. Suddenly, he was on rosters. Tour lineups. Magazines that called him Prodigy, even when he still had algebra homework. But he didn't feel famous. He felt invited to skate, to be, and the world, in its clumsy, curious way, began to take notice. Not because he was loud, or rebellious, or wild, but because when he skated, something inside people quieted, too. It felt good to watch him. Like seeing a song land perfectly in rhythm. Each frame of that lonely competition clip, each blurred second of air and landing and breath, became a kind of proof. That talent doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes, it just arrives, taped over someone else's footage. And in that tape, in that grainy flicker of sunlight on plywood, Tony stopped being just a boy. He started becoming a story. It wasn't sudden, not exactly. But one day there were more eyes than usual. More questions. More lights. Tony showed up to a skate park and someone handed him a contract. Another day, there was a camera crew waiting, white vans idling in the sun. Text on the screen said, "Up next, the Wonder Kid." The boy who'd made a name off silence and motion was now being asked to smile to repeat what he'd just done, but closer to the lens. It was exciting. A little strange. The skate world didn't usually live on cereal boxes. But now, with each taped wrist and signature shoe, it was inching into television's glow. He wasn't pretending, but he wasn't fully there, either. Every day came with schedules. Sponsors. Shoots. He'd sign posters between tries, change boards 5 times for 5 camera angles. People thought skateboarding was wild, untamed. But under the lens, it started to feel choreographed. Still, he skated, because when he dropped in, when gravity remembered him, all of it disappeared. Cameras couldn't touch the float between a lip trick and a landing. Microphones couldn't record the sound of his heartbeat quieting midair. Sometimes, photographers would ask him to hold a trick for the shot. He'd try. But it never looked the same. It wasn't what skating was to him. A rush of real-time choices. Not a pose. a feeling. At home, the walls grew heavier with memorabilia. Photos he didn't remember being in. Magazines that called him icon when he still felt like the same boy with bruises on both knees. There were interviews where they asked about fame, about being the face of a sport. Tony would pause, answer politely, thank them, but inside, he wondered if any of them knew how calm it felt just hearing the wheels roll again. No stage, no stage lights, just a board, a ramp, a pulse. He didn't resist the attention. But he didn't chase it, either. Others found competition. He found escape. After the contests were over and the TV vans rolled away, he'd stay back. Skate in the dusk until the parking lot lights blinked on. That's when he moved best. When he wasn't being watched. No choreography. No sponsors in the shadows. Just rhythm. Just flight. He wondered if people really saw him. Or only the shape he made in the air. Either way, it didn't matter. Because the board never asked. It only waited, and whispered. Again? A 540 spins once and a half. That used to be the limit. The edge of what most believed the human body could do on a skateboard without breaking. You went any further, and the math started to betray you. Momentum ran out. Air ran short. Landing became a rumor. But Tony didn't believe in the math. Not like other people did. He believed in effort, in rhythm, in something you couldn't measure with degrees or physics diagrams. He'd tried tricks that lived only in the space behind his eyes, replay them mentally before falling asleep, feel the board spin without it ever leaving the ground. Then he'd bring them into reality. Bit by bit, fall by fall. The question wasn't, can this be done? It was always, what if I try one more time? The ramps got taller, the drops steeper, but Tony kept climbing. He'd launch into motion nobody had language for, twists, grabs, spins that weren't borrowed from anyone else's notebook. One time he tried a new trick and slammed so hard, he cracked a rib. Another time, he landed on his elbow and saw stars for minutes. Someone asked why he kept doing it. He just shrugged. It's there, he said. Other skaters watched from the sidelines, half awestruck, half certain he'd gone too far this time. But Tony didn't talk much about pain. Not then. He just took his board, taped what needed taping, and dropped in again. Every time he fell, he took notes, in his muscles, not on a page. Mistakes became information. Bruises became blueprints. Some of the tricks he invented didn't even have names at first. Just shapes in the air, flickers of motion that hadn't been mapped yet. A move others would call impossible, he'd call work in progress. The 900 lived in his mind long before he tried it publicly. 2.5 full rotations in the air. No skater had ever landed it. But Tony wasn't interested in what hadn't been done. He cared about what could be, especially if it asked everything from him. In empty parks and warehouse bowls, he attempted the spin in secret. Clip after clip, crash after crash, he'd get closer, then fall harder, then closer again. Sometimes the board spun but his feet didn't find it. Other times, he would freeze mid-air, unsure if he was flying or just falling more elegantly. But he kept going, bleeding sometimes, laughing other times, always getting up. Because for Tony, the courage wasn't in the trick. It was in the trying. Trying until your body remembered something your brain hadn't figured out yet. Trying until flight didn't feel like a risk, but a return. The 900 wasn't ready. Not yet, but it was getting closer. Like thunder you can't see, but start to feel in your bones. All it needed was one more fall. And then one more after that. Until, maybe, the sky ran out of reasons to say no. There wasn't much money in skateboarding. Not then. Not when Tony was landing tricks that didn't have names, spinning toward a future no one was quite ready for. He wasn't getting rich. Not even close. He was chasing contests across counties, earning just enough gas money to make it to the next ramp. They paid in pocket change, in pizza vouchers, in the occasional motel room with a door that didn't lock right. And somehow, it was enough. Tony bought his first house with demo money. A few brand deals. A tour that paid him in slices and signed posters. Small, quiet victories. No red carpets. Just a front door that opened and closed when he asked it to. He painted the walls himself. Built a tiny practice setup in the back. Made peanut butter sandwiches and listened to the wheels of his board as they tapped out rhythms across the garage floor. When new neighbors asked what he did for work, he'd say, "I skateboard." They'd laugh. "A kid's hobby," they said. "A phase. A punk thing." Tony would smile, small and polite, and then go land a trick that physics still hadn't caught up to. There was a kind of poetry in the struggle. Morning coffee in gas stations. Sleeping two to a motel bed. Waking up sore and choosing to skate anyway. When money came, it came soft. An apparel sponsor. A check that cleared late. A magazine cover with his name misspelled. But he kept showing up. Because money wasn't the fuel. Movement was. He wasn't trying to be a celebrity. He was trying to fly. And sometimes, in the early morning before traffic and before noise, he'd practice alone in a parking lot, an unpaid, unfilmed moment. Just the sound of grip tape under vans. Just the stretch of asphalt like a chapel floor. There were nights when he considered quitting. When the numbers didn't make sense. When injury whispered louder than hunger. But something inside always said, "One more time. One more grind. One more push." Because even if the world didn't see it yet, he knew this. Skateboarding was real. It was work. It was art. And it didn't owe anyone explanation. He didn't chase riches. He outlived disbelief. With bruised elbows, empty wallets, and joy that couldn't be taxed. For a long while, skateboarding paid him in pizza. But what he was building? It tasted like permanence. The energy was fading, not all at once, but enough to notice. Magazine pages turned slower. Demo crowds thinned out. TV airtime got shorter, then vanished. Skateboarding, once a flame too bright to ignore, was cooling. Corporate sponsors stepped back, calling it a fad, a phase, a relic from a noisier decade. Tony heard it everywhere. Skateboarding's over. Grow up. Find something stable. Some pros retired. Moved on. Their boards traded in for resumes and quiet weekends. But Tony couldn't let go. Not yet. He was older now. Still lean, still alive. But something had shifted. He had a child. A mortgage. A body that creaked louder in the mornings. But also, still, the ramp. Still the sound of grip tape, the long pause before the drop, the rush of falling upward. Ramps were disappearing. Parks were shut down. The places that once echoed with cheers now gathered dust and slow weeds around their edges. Tony skated anyway, even when the magazine checks stopped coming. Even when contests had more photographers than fans. Even when trucks failed and no one had parts to spare. He'd find what was left. A half-built structure behind a grocery store. A fading asphalt swell in the corner of a park. And he'd ride. Not to prove anything, just to remember how it felt. There were days when he questioned it. Should he stop? Pick something simpler? Sign the last autograph and call this chapter complete? But the answer always came, not in sentences, but in the sound of his wheels carving through doubt like they always had. Late at night, he'd step onto his board and feel the quiet pull of the trick still unlearned, the spin not yet landed. The whisper of possibility. The world could call the era over. Could tear down the ramps, shutter the contests, strip the shelves of decks. But they couldn't take flight from him. Because even under a fading sun, with cameras turned away and crowds gone missing, Tony felt the same pull. That ache to launch, to try, to chase a feeling you couldn't keep but needed to touch anyway. Skateboarding didn't need an audience. It just needed him, to push off, lean forward, and meet the silent air. Not because the world was watching, but because he was still listening. It wasn't supposed to be history. Just another contest. Another summer afternoon with cameras and cheers. 1999, the X Games. The crowd buzzing like static behind the barricades. Tony Hawk stood on the ramp, helmet snug, heart louder than the speakers blaring from the sidelines. He'd tried it before, quietly, in empty parks and late evenings. The 900, 2.5 full rotations in the air. He'd spun closer, but never complete. Each attempt had taken something. Bruised ribs, fractured confidence, time. No one had landed it. Every skater knew the math. Too much spin, not enough air. Too fast, and you lost control. Too slow, and gravity won. But Tony wasn't thinking about gravity today. He was thinking about the ache in his knees. The quiet between tricks. The strange calm before a leap. His turn came. He dropped in. The first attempt, close. The second, closer. The third, the board slipped. He hit hard. The crowd winced. They waited. He stood back up. Try number 6, 7, 8. Commentators started whispering. Time had run out. The event was technically over. But Tony asked for one more. Skaters cleared the way. The crowd didn't leave. They knew something was happening. It wasn't a clean event anymore. It wasn't about scoring points. It was about every fall before this one. Every failed spin. Every night telling himself, just once. He stood at the top. Let the board roll. Bent his knees. Spun. 1, 2. Half more. Everything blurred. The board beneath him felt like memory. The air held its breath. And then, he stuck the landing. Knees low. Arms wide. Silence. Then thunder. The crowd exploded. Skaters rushed the ramp. Strangers screamed his name like it was theirs. Tony didn't shout. He didn't pump his fists. He smiled. Dropped his head. Breathing heavy. Grateful. Because it wasn't about being first. Or being famous. It was about finishing something he started when no one paid attention. A whisper from years ago finally landing on the ground on its feet. And for a moment, the whole world understood. It started with pixels, tiny ones, blinking shapes on a screen packed into plastic cartridges and dreams. Tony Hawk's Pro Skater. A name, a game, a whole new way to fly. He didn't plan it, not the fame, not the iconography. A developer reached out, a few meetings, a motion capture suit. He did impossible things with wires strapped to his limbs. They turned them into buttons. And just like that, the culture shifted. It wasn't just ramps and rails anymore. It was living rooms. Basements filled with kids who couldn't even kickflip yet, but could combo their way through Tokyo on a cheat code of adrenaline and music. They controlled him, flipping, grinding, spinning. At the press of a button. Points stacked like the dreams of every kid who pressed start and believed they could fly. He became a character, cartoonish at times, mythic always. A digital version of Tony that never aged, never missed. An avatar in baggy shorts defying gravity with glitchless grace. Millions who had never touched grip tape learned the language of skating by watching his name hover across loading screens. But Tony never stopped being real. While kids earned high scores in pixel parks, he was in real ones. Falling face first, trying tricks harder than the software could replicate. It was a strange split. Fictional Tony was untouchable, perfect, always landing, but real Tony still bruised, still bled, still missed sometimes. And yet, he didn't mind, because every time a kid picked up a controller, laughed through a manual, saw the word skateboarding, and didn't think punk or failure, something changed. The board on screen wasn't just a toy. It was an invitation to fall, to try, to feel the rhythm of movement even without wind in your face. Tony once made skateboarding beautiful for the skaters. Now, he was doing it for everyone else. He watched as the game reached places he never could, rural towns with no skate parks, countries where no one knew what a vert ramp was. They knew him, though, because of those endless nights under a television's glow where his pixels danced with impossible ease. He was a secret costume in other games, referenced in punchlines, immortalized in cheat codes. He became culture by accident, by permission, and through it all, he kept skating, kept falling, kept learning new tricks that the next game might mimic, but never fully capture. Because what the pixels couldn't know, what the buttons couldn't feel, was how it feels the moment right before leaving the ground. Or the silence between spin and landing. Or the heartbeat that shouts when no one sees you. The game made him a myth. But real life was still his favorite level. Midway through the 2000s, things changed, quietly. Not all at once, but through moments. A groan in the knees before the first drop. A soreness that lingered longer. The occasional wince when tying his shoes. Tony had spent decades learning how to fall. But now, the landing stayed with him. Hours later, days, he wasn't the kid anymore. Wasn't the quiet teenager making up tricks in backlot bowls. He was the man they all knew. The name, the game, the icon. And with that, came something new, stillness. A kind he wasn't used to. Airports blurred together. Hotels looked the same. He'd wake up in cities he forgot arriving in, turn on the hotel TV, and see himself 2 decades younger. He wasn't haunted by fame. Just unconvinced by it. Somewhere between skate parks and interviews, between early morning flights and late night rehabs, he had begun to wonder, where was the boy? The one who loved the feel of soft pavement under soft wheels. The one who didn't care if anyone watched. Was he still in there? He still skated, still worked new tricks, still taught clinics, still bled sometimes. But there was something deeper now. He'd crouch at the top of a ramp and linger a second longer. Not out of fear, out of gratitude. Because the air still wanted him. His kids were older. They watched him differently. Not like he was unstoppable, but like he made effort look beautiful. Sometimes they'd come to events. Hand him a water bottle. Tease him about limping. And he'd smile, not because it didn't hurt, but because it did and he still showed up. He talked more in interviews now. Slowly. Not in sound bites, but in pauses. He spoke about motion like it was a friend. About failure like it was furniture he'd grown used to. He never framed his life as a triumph. More like a pattern. Try, fall, try again. The tricks were different now. Maybe smaller, but the meaning had grown. At demos, younger skaters watched like pilgrims, not because he was still the best, but because he never stopped. He wasn't chasing medals. He chased the feeling. That half second in the air when gravity lets go and something like forgiveness takes its place. Even his body had learned to speak kindly. Every scar, every tendon, every swollen joint simply whispered, "You've lived." Tony didn't argue. He just taped up the wrist, stretched his knees, and rolled forward. There are athletes who burn bright and vanish. Others fade slowly like dusk. But once in a while, a few grow quieter, more refined. Not echoes, but melodies played softer. That was Tony now. The boy who once couldn't sit still had become the man who moved with calm. Poised, measured, graceful in ways the highlight reels never showed. People say time humbles you. Maybe, but it also sharpens you. Softens what doesn't matter, leaves what does. The movement, the balance, and the wind you earn, not chase. Tony kept skating, not to prove he could, but because, when he did, he still felt like himself. The truest version, stripped of noise, backlit by memory. Not flying to escape, but flying to return. The crowds faded. The posters came down. Skate parks emptied a little faster after demos. And the spotlight, once tethered to his shadow, learned to follow someone else. Tony didn't mind. He'd never chased the light anyway. He just kept skating. Some called him a relic. Others, an elder. But he wasn't trying to hold on to anything. He was trying to give it away. He stepped off the podium and into classrooms. Rolled through neighborhoods with no ramps and built them with his own money. Places where kids had drive. But no space to fall. No room to rise. He gave speeches. Soft ones. Spoke about falling as a kind of luck. About how every scar taught him to listen. He didn't need applause anymore. Only impact. He'd meet kids who had no idea who he was. No posters. No pro skater scores. Just feet twitching for balance and hearts too fast for stillness. And he'd hand them a board. Let them stumble. Let them scrape. Smiled when they asked, "Is it supposed to hurt this much?" He'd nod. Only at first. He became the person he once needed. Not a coach. Not a motivator. A kind of mirror. Proof that being different doesn't mean being broken. That softness can be strength when tied to motion. He didn't retire. He recycled. Every ounce of knowledge turned outward. Stopped cataloging his own wins and started noticing someone else's first ollie. Someone else's quiet triumph while their friends laughed from the sidewalk. He cheered anyway. Sometimes the media called to check in. Asked what he was doing these days. He'd say, "Still skating. Just differently." They didn't always understand. Fame likes a climax. A final trick. A graceful exit. But Tony wasn't closing a book. He was dog-earing the pages so someone else could pick it up. His name meant less to him now than it once did. But the weight it carried, he used it like a crowbar, prying open doors. City councils, design meetings, brands who once turned their backs now listening more than looking. He wasn't loud. He didn't need to be. His legacy wasn't just in records. It was in the ramps behind small-town libraries. In the beat-up sneakers on inner-city kids who never dreamed they could fly. He blended into the background. Wore his hat low. Carried a board older than some of the skaters beside him. And smiled when they asked, "You any good?" Used to be, he'd shrug. Then drop in and remind the wind who he was. Not for long. Just enough. Enough to leave the air warmer. The silence softer. He didn't need to be the face of skateboarding anymore. He was its memory. Its echo. Its whisper. Still rolling. Still giving. Still right there, just beyond the noise. He started falling again. Not because he had to. Not for a gold medal. Not for a camera crew tucked behind the ramp. But because falling had always taught him something. Tony was in his 50s now. The knees didn't bend the way they used to. The muscles needed longer to trust him. But the board still listened. And so he gave it one more try. He began filming himself in garages, in small parks, outside aging warehouses, places where echo was louder than applause. No choreographed promos, just clips of attempts, of misses, of the body remembering and forgetting and remembering again. Sometimes he fell hard, into padding, onto his side, once, flat on his back, the board flying off frame like a startled bird. He'd roll over, laugh, sit up slow, and try again. It wasn't performative, it was devotion. A love letter written in bruises. A dance with balance where grace was found in the getting up. And people watched, not because the tricks were record-breaking, but because they were human. There was poetry in seeing someone who once redefined a sport choose failure on purpose. Choose falling, not as defeat, but as a familiar part of the rhythm. He didn't speak much in the videos. Sometimes a breathless laugh, or a quiet, almost. That was enough. In a world addicted to polish, he showed the seams. The limps, the taped wrists, the grit behind the glory. He knew landing something for the 1000th time wasn't as romantic as doing it the first. But there was beauty in repetition. In persistence. In showing up even when history didn't ask you to. Fans wrote, "Thank you." Young skaters wrote, "Same." Elders wrote, "Still." He was no longer proving anything. Just showing something. That trying never gets old. That passion doesn't shrink with age, it sharpens. He wasn't invincible. He never had been. But now, he wasn't pretending. He was tender in ways the early posters never showed. More crackle than thunder. More ember than flame. And every fall made people feel a little more whole. A little more seen. Because here was their hero, still flying, still stumbling, still in love. He didn't need a crowd. Just the feel of pavement. The whisper of his board. The soft thump of a missed landing and the decision, again, to stand back up. In a world racing for perfection, Tony gave us something else. A still shot of what it means to fall beautifully. To age honestly. To remain full of fire, even as the body learns to burn slower. He didn't chase flight anymore. He welcomed it, and welcomed the fall, too. Because sometimes, truest motion lives not in the tricks we land, but in the getting up we choose. He didn't say it out loud. Not at first, but somewhere deep down, he knew. Every trick has a final time. Not the last time it's possible, the last time it's worth it. The last time it means what it used to mean. The 900 had been his mountain. For years, it shadowed him. Then, for a moment, victory. And then, a quiet echo. A whisper asking, "Could you still?" His body answered, not with a yes, not with a no, but with hesitation. There were still kids chasing versions of him they'd only seen on game covers. Still fans asking to see history repeat itself. He smiled. He stalled. He skated around the question. But one morning, maybe it was the light, maybe the air, maybe the softness of how the world turned that day, he decided. One more. He didn't tell anyone. Not really. Just a small crew. A quiet ramp. No audience. No press release. He began the warm-ups. Old tricks, familiar friends. The body cracked. The breath shortened. But that didn't matter. He wasn't chasing youth. He was chasing closure. He tried. Not once. Not twice. But dozens. Each attempt a conversation between now and then. Between what was and what still clung to the heart. Sometimes, the spin was perfect, but the board slipped. Sometimes, the air caught him, but the body didn't follow. He fell. Hard. Wheeled to the side. Sat in the quiet, hands over his helmet. Caught his breath. Reminded himself, this wasn't about proving anything. It never was. He stood. Tried again. And then, after every muscle questioned him, after every doubt had shouted and gone quiet, he landed. Both feet. Board steady. No stumble. No flourish. Just stillness. At the end of a miracle. He didn't raise his arms right away. Didn't cry. Didn't collapse. He just let the moment settle. Let the whisper return, and this time, say thank you. He stepped off the ramp slowly. Took off his helmet. Ran his hand through hair grayer than it used to be. Looked up at the sky he'd borrowed from for decades. Then walked away. Board in hand. Heart full. He didn't call it retirement. Didn't call it an ending. But somewhere inside him, he knew. That airborne sentence, written years ago, was finally punctuated. Not by applause, but by peace. Some tricks were never meant to fade. Only to be finished. With honor. In stillness. And grace. He never pushed him to skate. Tony knew better than that. Skateboards had always been an invitation, not an inheritance. So when Riley picked one up, rolled across the driveway for the first time, arms flailing like a newborn bird, Tony just watched. Not with correction, not with instruction, but with a kind of reverence. It was happening again, but differently. Riley didn't move like his father. Didn't favor the vert ramps or clean rotations. He liked the asphalt, the ledges, the uneven rhythm of street skating. More smirk than symmetry. And Tony, he loved it. Because it wasn't mimicry. It was origin, redrawn. Tony didn't offer advice unless asked. Didn't hover. He knew the best way to hold a passion is loosely. Let it spin under its own gravity. Sometimes he'd film Riley quietly from behind a fence or the corner of a warehouse. Not for content, just for memory. And every so often, they'd share a skate session. Father and son, not teacher and student, just two humans chasing balance. They didn't talk much during those rides. Didn't have to. The boards said enough. When Riley landed his first hard flip, Tony clapped once, quietly. Pride without performance. When he fell, a hard slam on his side. Tony winced, then waited. Riley stood, dusted off, and smiled. Tony nodded, like he'd just been told a secret he already knew. They saw the sport from opposite directions. Tony chased air. Riley stayed grounded. But in both styles, there it was. Poetry. Not in the tricks. In the trying. People asked if it was strange to watch the next wave coming through his own blood. But Tony didn't see it like that. Legacy wasn't something you handed off. It was something you lit, and let burn in its own shape. He never needed Riley to be him, only to find his own sky. And he did. Bit by bit, rail grind by curb slide, Riley built a voice with wheels and scrapes and stillness. And Tony, from the quiet corners, listened. Not as the icon, not as the pioneer, just as a father, watching his son take flight in a different way. Not through the air, but through belonging. In interviews, he doesn't rush. He lets thoughts hang, between the question and the answer, in the silence most people feel the urge to fill. But Tony doesn't mind silence. It's where most of his life made sense. He speaks the way he skates now, intentional, measured, gentle with the turns. Not about trophies, not about victories. He talks about fear, how it sat in his chest before every big trick, how he learned not to banish it, only to make room for it. One interviewer asked, "What does skating feel like for you?" He paused, then said, "Like remembering who I am." That's the part most people miss. Skating wasn't a rebellion. It wasn't adrenaline. It was memory. Gravity made graceful. A kind of prayer with shoelaces and scars. Tony doesn't narrate his achievements like chapters. He talks in moods, textures. What it felt like to fly versus how it looked. He remembers the wind more than the medals. The rhythm of his wheels more than the roar of the crowd. He compares falling to writing. Says it's how the story moves forward. Says pain never wasted its time on him. It always brought a sentence he needed. He reflects on the first time he saw someone smile after failing a trick. Called it sacred, not because they didn't hurt, but because they laughed anyway. He doesn't offer wisdom, exactly. More like perspective, soft-edged, careworn, clear. He says things like, "The board doesn't care how old you are." Or, "Balance isn't stillness, it's adjustment." And in those moments, the sport starts to sound less like movement, more like a kind of language, spoken from the inside out. He's honest about aging, about letting go of certain tricks, about listening to pain like a teacher showing up late. But he never sounds sad. Just aligned, like someone who made peace with every fall by turning its memory into flight. People still ask him what he wants his legacy to be. He shrugs. "I don't need one," he says. "Just hope I left a little more room for someone else to try." And somehow, that says more than any highlight reel ever could. Because in a world full of noise, Tony offered motion. Not to impress, but to understand. Skateboarding didn't make him a legend. It made him a kind of philosopher. One who speaks with knees and wrists and air tucked beneath the arch of a trick. One who learned that greatness isn't in being watched, but in finding the quiet when your feet leave the ground. It's hard to know the color of movement until you see it change someone. Not a headline, not a highlight reel, but a kid, halfway across the world, stepping onto a board for the first time. Shoes too big, helmet slightly tilted, eyes fierce with wonder. He doesn't know Tony Hawk by name. Not really. Maybe someone mentioned him. Maybe his cousin handed down a scratched video game disc. Maybe his school got a new skate park, funded by some quiet signature on a grant form. But when he pushes off and feels that first shaky roll forward, he smiles, as if someone just gave him permission to fly in his own direction. That's legacy, not a statue, not a trophy behind museum glass, but lift, past, person to person, wheels carrying the same whisper across map lines. Tony's movement outlived the moment. It became framework, invitation, not to copy but to contribute. In Johannesburg, a girl builds her first quarter pipe with her brother, pausing every few nails to watch YouTube clips. Some of them are his. Some aren't. She doesn't care. She just wants the air to feel like music under her wheels. In rural Nebraska, a boy lands his first heel flip on a cracked slab of driveway, wearing gloves because the winter hasn't let go yet. When he lands, he shouts, not for anyone else, just to hear his own echo. In the Philippines, a camera catches a crowded street lined with makeshift ramps, plywood, stacked bricks, laughter. No catchphrases, no sponsorship banners, just kids turning momentum into language. The color of movement isn't found in uniforms, not even in clean lines or beautiful form. It shows up in effort, in sneakers rubbed raw, in scraped elbows and quiet triumph. It exists wherever someone tries for no reason, other than they felt the weight of joy inside the risk. Skateboarding, as Tony lived it, wasn't noise. It was generosity, choice, trust between the body and the air it asks to borrow. Now, years later, his story repeats, not in replicas but in sparks. A girl in Detroit, a boy in Budapest, a crew under a highway overpass in Sao Paulo. What they have in common isn't style or fame, it's belief. That movement, however unsure, can become meaning. That falling isn't the opposite of flying, just its training wheels. And maybe somewhere, as another kid tapes up their grip, brushes dust from a hand-me-down helmet, and pushes toward their very first drop-in, Tony's name flickers across a search bar. A trick clip, a nod from someone older. Or maybe they don't hear his name at all. That's okay, too, because the gift arrived anyway. Not in person, but in motion. And in every country, every cracked sidewalk, every strip of wood echoing under wheels, there's proof that he left behind something weightless and yet impossibly strong. A color most people can't name until they move. There are photographs of him now. On walls, in books, behind glass. Frozen mid-air, knees tucked, arms wide, as if the sky itself reached down to lift him. But photographs don't breathe. They don't laugh or wince or mutter, one more trite, under-scraped breath. They miss things, like how his palms always opened seconds before landing, or the way he whispered to the board, a rider asking permission, never demanding. Time immortalized him in pixels and ink. But Tony never belonged to time. He belonged to motion. The archives show medals, footage, games with his name on the box. But rarely do they show the quiet moments. The dark arena before the crowd files in. The hush between fall and attempt. The way his breath synced with the curve of a ramp. You can study his tricks. Slow them down, zoom in. Still won't explain them, because his real gift wasn't innovation. It was belief. A trust that if he left the lip with just the right push, if he closed his eyes for half a second, the world might hold him. People ask how he did it. How he kept skating, past the glory, past the injuries. As if legacy was fuel. But Tony never skated for legacy. He skated for silence. For the hush that came midair, before wheels met wood again. That divine quiet when everything made sense, if only for a blink. He didn't try to be remembered. He tried to stay honest. To the board, to the bruise, to the boy he'd been before the world ever cared. And maybe that's what made it sacred. The way he stayed small, even as the world made his name large. Not humble, just real. Like a window left slightly open, so the wind could still come in. There are halls of fame that hold his name, speeches that end with applause. But he would tell you, skating isn't about being seen. It's about seeing yourself, your limits, the shape of joy when it catches air. And maybe when he's gone, really gone, they'll try to summarize him. A pioneer, a legend, the godfather of vert, but those words will feel too heavy, too final. Because the truth? Tony was never just one thing. He was proof. That movement makes meaning. That staying in love with something is an act of survival. And that sometimes, if you're lucky, what starts as escape becomes legacy by accident. Some stories don't end, they just quiet down, like the wheels still spinning after the board stops moving. Tony never needed speeches, never needed to be called legend. He heard those words and felt them fall short. Because what he built wasn't a monument, it was a path. Plywood, persistence, a belief that motion could be meaning. Now, when he skates, he doesn't push for airtime. He listens to his body, to his breath, to the air still welcoming the weight of what he loves. He knows the world remembers the 900, the games, the fame, but memory is not what he rides on. It's muscle, it's pattern, and somewhere deep, it's peace. Because peace isn't stillness. It's knowing you moved towards something honestly, wholeheartedly, and long enough for it to move without you. In cities he's never seen, there's laughter at new skate parks. Not built to honor him, but because of him. That's how legacy breathes. Not in echoed names, but in unspoken permissions. You can fall. You can begin late. You can be soft and still fly. He gave skateboarding something it didn't always ask for. Gentleness, humility, endurance. And when asked what it all meant, the records, the video games, the spotlight, the pressure of being a forefather for an art that kept reinventing itself, he said this: "I just liked how it felt to try. So maybe that's all it ever was." A boy who once cried too easily found a way to move through the world. Not by changing who he was, but by doubling down on it. And decades later, amid copies of his game collecting dust, boards worn thin with someone else's dreams, kids landing tricks beneath overpasses, it's all still speaking. Not loudly, not with headlines, just an echo, a whisper on a breeze. The small song of wheels on concrete. The soft sound of someone trying.